And welcome to the latest Scots We Hate podcast. And today I'm joined by musician Joe Mango and theatre maker Liam Hurley to talk about A Giant on the Bridge, which will be at the Edinburgh Fringe at the Assembly Roxy Central, 10:40 AM between the 2nd and 18th of August. Hello, Joe and Liam.
Hi,
Hello.
it's great to be here.
So, Joe, let's start with you and the initial question that bound to ask. What can you tell us about A Giant on the Bridge and how it came about?
Well, it's a big question. It's a piece of gig theatre, which means it's a gig, but it also has a narrative heart. And in this case, it's got 5 different narrative strands that are all taken up by the 5 different performers in the show, who are Louis Abbott of Admiral Fallow, myself, Louise McCraw from Goodnight Louisa, Kim Grant, who is Ravelo, and Dave Hook, who is the rapper Solarai from Stanley Odd. And gig theatre is a new thing for all of us, except Liam. And he'll tell you about that later, I'm sure. But it came about because 4 out of 5 of us have been involved in a charity called Vox Liminis, who pairs songwriters with people involved in the criminal justice system to explore different issues around about criminal justice. And we did a big research project called Distant Voices Coming Home, where we explored what's difficult about the moment of coming home from prison, from lots of different perspectives. And songwriters were paired with people who were about to do that, come out of prison, but also people who were maybe family members of those who'd been in prison and were about to see that from the other side, to have that person go away and then come back. People who work in that area as well, so probation officers, for example, who try and bridge that transition, people who work in prisons helping that transition, and then also people who've been harmed by crime and who might have a different perspective on what it means for someone to come out of prison who might have caused them harm. And we wanted to make something out of the end of that was representative of what we learned from over 150 songs that were written with over 200 people across that project. Not by the 4 of us, it was a bigger team of songwriters, like Chris Drever, Emma Pollock, C. Duncan were all keenly involved as well, amongst others, other amazing musicians. And so we also noticed that when we were playing the songs at gigs, people were often really interested in the introductions that we gave to the songs as much as they were the songs, like what we said about who wrote the song and where they were situated and what their situation was, often had a really big impact on how people heard the songs. And so we thought, we've made a big art form of the songs themselves, but we haven't actually thought about the art of the introduction to the song and what comes between the songs. And that's the point at which we got Liam involved, dramaturg, scriptwriter, director that he is, to think about that, the bits between the songs. How could we make them an art form, but also how could we make a gig that would represent the key themes that we'd been learning through that process? I hope that's a concise enough answer for you.
It's absolutely fascinating, and there's so much to dig into there. But Liam, so this was the point, as Joe's just said, that you kind of came on board.
Yes.
How did you begin to approach it? How did you even begin, especially when you hear how many songs and stories that there are to kind of get involved in?
Yeah, just kind of in at the deep end, really. You really knew what you were about, Joe. You had a whole kind of process of that kind of sifting down to kind of make a kind of a long list of selections of songs, and then from that short list, that was a process that was already underway in Joe's hands. You had this lovely phrase, Joe, of like a little kernel of a narrative idea, or a little encapsulating a common experience within the criminal justice system. Joe would call them pebbles. And so we had these little kind of cairns of conceptual pebbles to kind of like work with. And I guess if you were to continue that metaphor, then my job was to kind of like find a little path, little hopscotch path with the pebbles towards some sort of coherent story. it's always messy. Collaborating's always about there's these waves of making a mess then tidying it up, and that's the way it kind of should be, really, I think. And so even though there were these very accomplished kind of fully realized songs to work from, the kind of process of extrapolating narrative from a bank of collective experience, you kind of just got to wade in there and start chucking ideas about and see where you get. And that's how it always is in my experience. Is you have to kind of roll your sleeves up and get a little bit. You kind of embrace the chaos for a while, and then bring some order to it. Because we've left the chaos long behind, haven't we, Joe? We've just been in a world of order for a long time now.
But I have to add, and this is always important in this project, that we had loads of collaborators. So although the headline is that Liam and I devised it, that really means that we kind of headed up the process. But there are loads of other people who co-created it with us, the musicians in the show, the people who co-wrote the songs in different places, but also specific people with lived experience of all the issues in the show were involved in the development of all these strands in different ways, whether that be remotely or directly involved. So it wasn't just taking the songs and then us writing what we wanted to write about. There was a really careful process of involving people who have lived that experience as far as we could in every aspect.
Well, I could just say a little bit more with reference to the content that we ended up developing, which was Joe was very clear at the point of inviting me on board. Joe was very clear that there should be a folkloric strand to the narrative based around a traditional story around a giant who has a prison experience. We'll just say that much. And so that was there. That was like a given. And then, having recently kind of had, quite a rich experience of supporting a kind of multi-layered piece of gig theatre, I was quite keen to sort of develop these separate strands that each individual performer would take the lead on narratively, and also, Alistair, to sort of really free the performer up to be themselves telling a story rather than an actor. So to me, that was like a really important kind of principle, that we're going to be here doing the day job, as it were, in our comfort zone as musicians. I'm not a musician, but for the performers, that we're going to be there as a band and as performers doing what they do best, but they're also going to be taking that step into telling stories in a way that none of them had ever done before. And I really wanted them to feel like able to be themselves primarily in that. And so that was quite key. And then from that, of course, there's a whole world of characterization that you can bring to the active storytelling. But it's different from being an actor primarily. It's a different ask. And so we were clear, okay, let's develop these 5 stories that each performer can take the lead on telling their story, and alternate between them, mix that up with the songs, and then ultimately those 5 stories, without giving too much away, ultimately them bumping up against each other a little bit more than you might have thought initially. And so Joe had this folkloric strand idea from the outset. We both kind of thought early on, Solarai being the voice of the homecomer from prison, the person who's about to embark on that transition. We thought from prison to a home environment, we thought that would, be a good way to go. And then the other pieces, Louis Abbott, for example, representing somebody that does the sort of job that the songwriters do within the prison environment, that emerged pretty quickly. And in a couple of other cases, things kind of found their own way.
Before we get into those characterizations, Joe, and ask you, being someone who is on stage, Joe mentioned the term gig theatre. Liam, can you maybe expand on that? Because I think it's one that many people won't have heard before.
Yeah, it's been quite within the theatre world, within the Scottish theatre world, it's quite a well-established little sub-genre, which essentially, it can take different forms. The form that I am personally most familiar working with is working with musicians that want to make more theatrical work. So that would be you might get different definitions of what that means. but yeah, musicians who wanted that, you know, exactly the way that Joe put it, in terms of like, okay, how can we make more out of this bit of the gig experience? And then, of course, what audiences will come and see in August at the Roxy. Hopefully everyone listening to this will be inspired to come along. But what they will experience is very theatrical piece, as much as it is a gig, but it is a gig as well. And so there's that combination of the two can take so many different forms. For me, it means supporting musicians to create more theatrical live work, essentially, that has narrative and that has them step into a different performative mode than they're used to inhabiting.
I think I've actually seen a couple of examples without knowing that that's maybe the term that they were, but the National Theatre of Scotland, I think, have done a few examples of that.
Absolutely, yeah, some cracking ones, yeah.
And Liam mentioned this idea of you know, the musicians on stage kind of being characters without acting and being themselves. And I was wondering how, because usually you're telling your own stories. How is it to tell other people's stories? What is it, a different process?
I think we were much more comfortable once we started presenting it as, this isn't my story, I'm telling someone else's story, because none of us have been to prison or come home from prison. We do have, a number of us do have experiences that are represented in the show. For example, Louis knows exactly what it's like to be a songwriter who works in a prison and helps people to write songs about it. So that is essentially his story as well as his character's story. And there are elements for a number of us where we do have that experience, but there are other elements like Dave narrating the story of Dee, and we don't want anyone to mistake us saying that we have had those experiences. So it's clear for us that we're telling a fictionalized story that is someone else's experience, and that makes us more comfortable. It's been really, I think we all are storytellers. We really tell stories in our songs, and when we're on stage, most of us have a persona that's telling the introductions in between, and it's kind of stepping into that and owning it more. It's been a really great process of understanding a bit more about what that is. Some people consider it all, you know, Nicki Minaj has got an alter ego, so she thinks about it all the time. Have I ever related myself to Nicki Minaj before? Probably not. But it's been really kind of revelatory in that way. And also working with our movement director, Janice Parker, has been absolutely brilliant. She comes in and helps us to expand on what we would do naturally bodily and just make it bigger and work more for us. And that's been a beautiful process as well, which I've learned a lot from. And hopefully musically as well, just to consider how we're moving and being and owning the stage. And that's added an awful lot to the storytelling process. I think all of us have found muscles we didn't know we had, and really enjoyed flexing them, which is why everyone's wanted to carry on doing the show beyond its first inception, as well as it being an incredible set of stories and a subject that needs to be talked about and we all believe in. First and foremost.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because I guess there's a long tradition of musicians adapting and telling other people's stories going way back, but with everyone involved, not just in the show that's going to Edinburgh, but in the previous one as well, I consider them all storytellers in their music. That's kind of almost to the fore of what you and they do as well. I just did wonder how, you know, that kind of shift to being, because when it's your story, you know everything about it, even the subtext and the things that aren't said in the song. But here, I mean, do you really have to work to understand the story as well as what you're singing, perhaps?
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. And we have kind of co-generated the story, thinking about us as performers, who we are, how we perform, what would suit our performing characters. So the 5 characters in the show do suit each one of us in a peculiar way and have been developed in that way. I also think that one of the themes in the show is about letter writing, which is obviously quite a big thing for people in prison. And it's also the bridge metaphor. It's one of the ways in which people bridge a gap that prison presents them with. And there's a song that begins the show called Dear Everyone, which is a song that is essentially a letter to a former self, to a future self that was never allowed to be because of imprisonment, but also to the audience, to ask them to perceive the writer in a different way. It's a very powerful song. And to me, I think a lot about how songs are like letters. Loads of them are specifically that way. We've got to have our #1 hit, Hey There, Delilah. It's a letter to Delilah in New York City. Not a classic, but the first one that sprang to mind. There's loads of letter songs. And there's a theme in the show about what kinds of letters songs can be, how we can reach out to people with songs, what songs can do to bring people together and to bridge gaps. And I suppose that's how I see the storytelling. The beginning of the storytelling element there is this idea of writing a letter to someone and inviting that dialogue. I don't know if Liam's got more to say. He's nodding away there.
Liam, in terms of, you've got the basis of a structure in terms of the songs and the stories and the people who are going to be on stage. How do you then make theatre from that? So it's not just a gig. So, I mean, Joe mentioned a movement coach, I think, that, you know, that was there. So how do you approach kind of making it a piece of theatre?
Well, big question. So many different stages to it. I mean, those basic elements that you mentioned, to me, that's your bare bones already. There's a kind of a funny joke that I heard about theatre making, because it's so collaborative. It's innately, unavoidably, beautifully collaborative as an art form, and that everybody involved thinks that they are the show. So it's like, from my point of view, I'm like, well, you know, I sort of, you know, helped shape all these stories, and, you know, I'm directing it, so of course, like, it's my show. The performers are the ones on stage. Without them, there'd be sweet FA happening. And so it's like, they know that they are the show, you know. And so, like, but of course, you know, everybody bringing in, and we can think about this kind of amazing creative team that we've got. We're really blessed. Joe mentioned Janice Parker and Movement, but everyone that we've got involved is really, really amazing in their own department. And they, from their own position, will be kind of like focused on that level of the show and taking ownership of the piece in that way. And that's ultimately what makes it work, I think, is when all of the collaborators with their own departments and specialisms all take ownership in a separate way. And theatre, just, it's about that alchemy where the different art forms meet. And so for me, we're presenting this piece at the Fringe as, you know, a piece with high production values. But for me, just those very basic elements of songs and stories, that's the starting point. And to me, it's like, you know, it's cool to talk about gig theatre as a buzzword, for example. Certainly as something very distinct from musical theatre, in case that hasn't been clear yet. You know, so it's cool to talk about that. But for me, there's actually something very, very timeless and in culture that's, with humans have always told stories and sung songs. Yeah. You know, and it's just like, actually, this gig theatre format with these theatrical production values that we're presenting as this top flight kind of offer within the festival, the Fringe, like, to me, that's just another version of something that we just know innately, and that's to curry in together and share songs and stories. So that's the ultimate theatricality, you know.
For me, it's been amazing, you know, not having been involved in theatre before. It's been amazing just to see, when you get a set designer along and a lighting designer, and suddenly your keyboard's not on a stand, but it's on a bookshelf, and it's got vines growing up it, because we're in a house, not on a stage, or we're in a wasteland instead of, you know. And so seeing even just my kit and what I play being transformed into this different, exciting, evocative environment has been really, really cool. And just thinking about how lighting changes things, which we do think about in gigs, but not in the same way, it's been really great.
Do you think that might change your future stage shows, Joe, and you might have a real theatrical extravaganza going on?
Oh, if I had the money, Alistair, I would have me a set designer for every show, for sure.
and it's already been staged. It's already been, I think it was at the Traverse, is that right? Previously. Well, how was that? How was it, you know, to have it realized on stage?
It was the end of well, not the end, but culmination of a long dream, because it was supposed to be on stage the month that COVID hit.
Oh.
I joked that when the big toilet paper famine happened at the beginning of COVID, I was absolutely fine because I had all these gig posters. I was like, I'll just chop them up. I'll be absolutely fine. I was just trying to make light of the terrible situation. It was bad timing. So we turned it into a kind of lockdown living room version, and then we turned it into a film, and we tried to give it the life that it should have. But until it was there on that stage, being performed in front of the audience and getting that amazing reaction that it did, it was sold out twice at the Traverse. Yeah, it just felt like this is where it was originally intended to be. It's where all the participants thought it was going to end up, and it felt great for it to be there. It's still on its journey, though. You know, it's different for the Fringe, and it's still moving forward. And as Liam and I said, getting better with each iteration, I think. So it's super exciting.
I was going to ask that question, Liam, if it is changing for the Fringe, which Joe's just answered, but how is it changing for the Fringe?
It's shorter for a start. It kind of has to be for the kind of the Fringe audience, really, and working with the Assembly, who, you know, have got quite a quick turnaround.
Yeah.
So yeah, the March version of the show was 2 hours including an interval, or more or less 2 and a bit hours including an interval, which was very important to us to kind of to not edit the songs for a start, and to really sort of give them the fullest platform possible, and to really kind of offer an experience that was a full evening's worth of showcase, as well as a kind of a real deep dive into this narrative experience that was also going to give audiences a really fulsome kind of gig experience as well. And that was really important in terms of the kind of event we wanted to offer, and in terms of honouring all of the amazing input of this really wide community of interest that whose involvement predated my involvement in the show, you know, but who's, you know, it falls to us to kind of serve them as best we can. So that was the ethos then. For the Fringe, it has to be shorter, and so it's an 18-minute show, and we're kind of feeling all the better for it, I think, actually. So yeah, kind of punchier.
But what I was going to say is, for anyone who's going to the Fringe and looking for tickets, 80 minutes is still a good 20 minutes longer than most shows. So value for money, it's definitely, you're going to get it.
We're all about value, Alistair.
You get your musical event and your theatre event in one. You just got comedy to add to that, and I think you've got your festival.
Yeah, the triumvirate.
Could be done by 3 o'clock. You've got it all in.
I was thinking about the different styles of music and the range of musicians that you have, and I now realise, having spoken to you, that it's different characters as well. So does having the different styles and the different individuals keep the stories individual? For instance, if you just had, say, one musician telling all the stories, then they might not be as distinct as they are.
Yeah, I think it's a key part of how the show functions, because one of the key things it explores is how music can help us talk to each other about things that we're usually divided by. The thing about imprisonment is it takes people off and we shut them away and they're out of the conversation, and it stops that dialogue that's maybe needed to make the system better or make justice better. And it was important to us. And because we have all these different perspectives that can be quite oppositional on that moment of homecoming, it's very different for different people that are involved in that moment when someone comes home from prison. And so the big question for the show is, how do we get those different perspectives to talk to each other? And for me, as a musician and a musical director, that's the question I ask myself when I say, well, how are we going to merge a hip hop artist with a folk singer-songwriter, with an electro pop artist? How do we make those genres talk to each other? And I know what excitement and beauty and challenge and newness, originality can come from that dialogue, that genre dialogue. And so I think that needs to be represented in the show, because there are these different perspectives and these very different characters from different places. It's one of the frustrations I have with some musical theatre is that it gets genreized, and you have like an axe wielding murderer who sings in the same style as your little girl orphan. And I just think there's no way, you know, that's a heavy metal voice right there. Do you know what I mean? And so I was really glad to get my teeth into a piece of theatre that can contain different genres and do it really well. So that was my excitement for it.
And Liam, when you were thinking about characterization, did the style of music of each individual come into that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, particularly in the case of Solarai, where his stories are very similar to a couple of his musical numbers, because a lot of his stories are told through bars, through hip hop lyrics. So yeah, I think it's not giving too much away to say that the kind of device there that we the framing up of that within the stories, Alistair, is that the character in prison, he kind of copes through writing himself raps, and so there's a line at the very start of his story, his very first piece of storytelling, which says, "If we could hear inside this guy's head right now, it would sound like this," and then he's off, and we're into this really fluid, beautifully crafted piece of verse that Solarai delivers. And so, yeah, I think it's funny because, again, it's that collaborative thing. I said to Dave, the professor of the book, at one point, I said to him, I just sort of chucked out the phrase, it's like, yeah, oh yeah, okay, the guy, he's got a lot on his mind, but luckily he's got a reliable mechanism for organizing his thoughts, his interact. And he's like, mate, that's what rappers all say. Is that this is a way, this art form is a way of organizing my experience into coherent thought. So that's one example. And with the others, I believe so. I think it's for me, there's this huge bank of songs that were written. To me, it's interesting to hear you speak, Joe, because to me there's also there's quite a distinctive sound across them. There is a coherence, and actually, it could be an album. It could, multi-genre, collaborative, very much so. But there's a coherence there in which it could be an album. And so for me, there was something about, there was already a style to work with, and there was already a feel that we could sort of tell what sort of a feel the audience would be getting from the gig experience. And so that's our jumping off point into how we're offering the stories. So yeah, very much so. Yeah, one influencing the other, absolutely.
And have you had feedback from audiences? And does that might not change the show, but does it change the way that you feel about the show?
It has changed the show, hasn't it, Joe?
Yeah, it has. Yeah. When we were thinking, because we had to do a lot of chopping down, obviously, and we've thought a lot about what people have said to us about the original version. Maybe they had a question at the end of the show, like, "Oh, what's going to happen with that?" Or, what was the significance of that? Or, and we've thought more about. We've also been really moved by a lot of the reaction to the show that is very emotional, in joyful as well as difficult emotions. A number of people who've been through that experience of coming home from prison themselves, or who had a family member, a dad who came home when they were younger, and they said they recognized themselves in the story really deeply, which was really important to us, to know that we're representing that experience. We've done everything that we can so that we could do that, but it's great to hear that feedback. It's also been wonderful to hear feedback from people who work in the system and have come along and have said that it's made them think again about their sentencing decisions, or what goes on after they've passed a sentence on someone, or if they work in a prison, how they're interacting with people. Loads of different people have thought about it really deeply, more deeply than I could have hoped, I think. And that's been incredibly gratifying to hear what an effect it's been having on people. And also just, great stories of people loving the songs and going away singing them for days afterwards too. So yeah, it's been great.
It seems to me, I was talking to someone else about this who's also got a Fringe at the show at the Fringe that's an intensely personal story, that they were saying it seems to them that the more personal the story is, the more individual the story is, actually the greater the empathy almost that comes from that. Because there's I think it's something to do with truth. I haven't quite put my finger on it, but you know that there's it feels if it's true, then the people kind of empathize with it. Do you think there's something to that, Liam? Yeah, you've been doing a lot of theatre. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, specific and therefore universal, I think, is the way to really encapsulate that.
That's
absolutely.
A good way.
Yeah. For me, it's been really interesting, just with what Joe was just speaking to there about how the show's meeting audiences in terms of this subject matter, because from the very start, it was very clear that Joe was holding down that side of things so strongly. And I was like, okay, that kind of frees me up to kind of like vibe on other thematic, you know, resonances in the piece. So like the theme of homecoming, there was a while I was banging on about that, about this kind of like, oh yeah, this, you know, everyone in the audience, whatever their relationship with the criminal justice system, will sort of like really, you know, that universal theme of homecoming. So I think that is there in the specificity of this story. And then there's this strand which I was really getting in March, which was each of the characters represented copes with really, really challenging circumstances through recourse to creativity in different ways. And for me, that wasn't we never sat down and said, let's make a piece about that. For Joe, it's always the redemptive and transformative power of music in a hard situation. It's always been there for Joe. But for me, there's actually there's like a handful of different forms of creative expression which feature thematically in the piece. And to me, that's another universal experience which is there in the specificity. And then what's also been really true for me now is to really come back round to just this theme. You know, I wasn't involved in the early stages of consultation and collaboration with all this huge community of interest around criminal justice. And so I sort of, as you're hearing, I kind of took it on as my job to find more in the piece than that. Yeah. But for me, there's always a point, like in the final, you know, days and hours before a show goes up, where you're not seeing the wood for the trees. You're just so focused on getting the job done and getting it on stage. And then once the piece meets the audience, you kind of go, oh, this is the story that we're telling, because the audience is hearing it for the first time and you're experiencing it landing with them for the first time. And the clarity of the story that you're telling is just so present and immediate. And it's like a revelation again. And so for me to have that experience around this particular theme, which has such potency for so many people, I think even there is the universality which is there in the piece, but the specificity around, as Joe's been using the word conversation, you know, or just opening a conversation through art about this particular subject is it's very needed at this point. And you know, we've got a mind to get in Mr. Timpson in the audience if we can, because it's become such a resonant theme in the media as well in recent days.
I think we did this really cool process of, you know, as Liam's saying, sometimes you get a bit lost in the detail or larger than the detail. And we just had this process of always coming back to the songs and saying this whole thing folded out of the songs. And musical theatre is a bit different because maybe you've got a story and then you write the songs to carry the story. I guess it works often in that way. But with this gig theatre, we started with the songs, and everything that we've done is folded out of the songs. So if ever we felt a bit lost or in the editing process, are we doing the right thing or not? It was going back to the songs and saying, well, what's in the songs? And we were never lost because those were anchoring us. And that's been a really beautiful thing, just to keep coming back to what's been communicated in those songs, and to know that that everything else is growing it larger, giving it roots and branches, and just taking it somewhere new, but still with the heart that was intended.
Joe, Liam said that, you know, it really, when the audience first see it, suddenly kind of all the other stuff kind of clears. Was that how it was for you as well? You know, you'd been so focused on getting all the little aspects right and working, in suddenly, oh yeah, we're telling stories here.
Yeah, it comes alive in a totally different way when you're in a room because they're making it too. It's not just you made it and then you're presenting it to them. They're a
Yeah.
part of generating what it is in the room, the atmosphere. In a great gig, they'll be sucking the sound out of you. You know, it feels like an active thing that it's being drawn out of you into the audience. So it's just totally different. And to hear when people laughed and when people gasped and when people were crying, just to have that reflected back at you, or sometimes it would surprise you, or you think, oh yeah, that's a more powerful moment than even I was expecting. It was, yeah, I definitely felt that too.
And a very different experience from just a normal gig that you would be doing.
Oh yeah, a whole lot more terrifying. In a brilliant way. Yeah, very different. I've loved every moment.
And now it's going to Edinburgh. Liam, is there something we've talked about how you've had to cut it down for those kind of practicality reasons? Is there something different about an Edinburgh Fringe show that, you know, that you could explain, you know, different to just having on in the same theatre every night, or even in different theatres every night?
I'm thinking of something our production manager, Fee Fraser, said. So we're very lucky to have Fee on board with this project. And we were sort of, you know, earlier this year, following the spring mini tour, and we were just looking at like the circumstances around taking the show to the Fringe, and it, you know, there's an intensity, which is something you need to be ready for. You need to be ready for the intensity of presenting something within that context. But the payoff is like exponential in return, potentially. That's the thing. And the way that Fee put it was, magic can happen at the Fringe.
Yeah.
You know, she was like, because we were sort of like balancing up, just like, okay, there's this limitation and that limitation and this thing you need to bear in mind. And it's like kind of like, oh my God, is the juice worth the squeeze kind of, you know, consideration. And Fee just sort of like encapsulated it in that way. And yeah, I would absolutely concur. There is magic that can happen.
And Joe, at the very beginning, you mentioned the original numbers of songs that happened from Distant Voices and Vox Liminis. So in theory, you could do, you know, a whole load of these with different songs.
Oh my gosh, 10 other ones. Oh, I spent my life doing that. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more. There were so many other stories we could have told. A different group of people who were guiding it would have picked different pebbles, and maybe we would have had different cairns and different songs, and this would have been a different story. But I think, you know, we crunched those 150 songs and we made a table of all the themes that was in every one, and I'm confident that we've picked a bunch of the songs that have the longest tentacles, that make the most connections with the most other songs. There are other ways we could have done it, but the way we talked about it was sometimes listening to resonances. You know, if you sing a note into a guitar, it'll vibrate if you sing the right note, or into a piano. You see Sigur Rós doing it with their pickups on their guitar. You get resonance, and that's another note that sings back at you. And it's similar to what I was saying about when you're performing in front of the audience and you feel them giving you something in the same way that you're giving them something. We kind of thought of ourselves as singing into the research project and listening really hard for what was resonating with what we were singing, and working along those lines, if that makes sense. So there could have been another show. I'm not going to make that other show. It's been feels like the work of a lifetime to make this one happen. But it is a process I'd love to do again, because I think it's a very powerful way of understanding people's experience. You know, it's just very different, a way of learning about something and then expressing it.
In a parallel universe, there's a very different A Giant on the Bridge show, because, you know,
yeah, let's leave the person in the parallel universe doing it. They can do that work.
It's not as good. I have to say, it's not as good. In all the multiverse options, I think ours is
the best.
Excuse me. Yeah, ours is the best. Yeah.
It sounds like it's going to be an amazing, a fantastic show, for all the reasons we've mentioned and a whole lot more. Before we say cheerio, I think you should remind people when and where it's on. So who went to go? Yeah.
It's on every morning at 10:40, between the 2nd and the 18th of August, with a couple of exceptions, at Assembly Roxy. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well,
Great way to start your day.
oh, I can't think. Absolutely. Yeah. Get a nice coffee, nice breakfast, and then head to the Roxy. Yeah. I always think you should make the most of your Edinburgh. Don't just say, I'll go in the afternoon. Get
Yeah.
there. There's lots of great things going on.
Yep. Get fresh ears on it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, the both of you, for taking the time to talk to me, and all the very best for Edinburgh.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Alistair. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.